Definition of elder abuse is any act or inaction that causes harm or physical harm to an older person.
There's so many different theories behind what causes abuse. And I think that if we pinpoint it to just one cause, then we miss out. Caregiver stress is considered a contributing factor. Family members' caregiver stress as well is significant. Addictions like gambling, drugs, and alcohol often result in our financial abuse situations that we see. Ineffective coping, poor communication skills, lack of health knowledge and health teaching. All of these are things that are contributors that set the stage for abuse.
The majority of reports of elder abuse concern financial abuse in one form or another.
The most common type of abuse is financial. We see about 80% of cases are financial. But I would suggest that any other case of abuse that I've been involved with always has some kind of financial implication. So it might be a verbal or physical, and it might be just $5 that they're trying to take, but it still has that financial implication.
Financial abuse could be the misuse of power of attorney. It could be theft, frauds, scams.
One of the biggest cases I saw in long-term care was a woman in her 80s with advanced Alzheimer's disease, and her adult daughter took $122,000 of her funds, gambled it all away. And she was criminal. She served house arrest for 2 years and was required to pay restitution. Physical abuse is any physical harm or risk, threat of harm to an older adult. Or it can also be withholding or over-medicating.
An example of physical abuse would be slapping, punching, pinching, anything that causes physical discomfort or harm to the older adult.
There's a bit of a gray area around things like forced feeding and rough handling. That's the area where it's not necessarily clear if it's crossed over into criminal or if it's just abuse. As far as over-medicating or under-medicating, there have been cases where seniors have been sedated by either a professional caregiver or family member, maybe to manage their behavior or to ensure that they sleep for longer periods of time. That's considered a physical abuse, and it's also considered criminal. Withholding medications, we've had lots of cases where perhaps family members are keeping narcotics that the senior needs for their own wellness and either selling them or using them for their own use. So those are the different types of physical abuse you can see. Sexual abuse is defined two ways according to the Long-Term Care Act. The first component of it is any sexual relationship, sexual touching or intercourse by a family or by a caregiver or a volunteer. So care providers are not allowed to have relationships with residents in care. The other type is any non-consensual by another person. It could be a resident to resident, it could be perpetrated by a family member or someone external to the home. It's the hardest type of abuse for us to talk about. We don't like to think that it exists, but unfortunately, we do have reports of it all the time.
Psychological abuse could be threats to do harm, name-calling, bullying, threats to institutionalize a senior.
It's more difficult to detect because it doesn't leave bruises and it damages a person. And when you're in a care facility, it's important to define to staff members the harm is what the victim or the resident perceives as harm, not what you perceive should be harmful. So leaving someone an incontinence product and sitting in their own waste, maybe someone might say, well, that's not harmful, their skin was fine, they were warm. But if someone is a really dignified person, having to sit in their own waste really does erode their self-esteem, and that's significant psychological abuse.
Neglect, examples of that would be a caregiver that intentionally fails to provide the necessities, certain necessities of life.
Neglect, luckily, isn't something we see as often in long-term care settings. Historically, it was more of an issue where people's care needs weren't being met, where call bells were being removed so that seniors didn't have access to the services and care that they need. Neglect is very harmful in the community. When someone's being neglected by their caregiver at home. They run risk of malnutrition, they run risk of dehydration, falling and remaining without care, and often these things can result in death.
Some of the challenges in regards to elder abuse is the reporting. There's always a lack of reporting, or a very small percentage of elder abuse gets reported.
Elder abuse is a taboo subject. It's not something that seniors like to talk about. Quite frankly, it's not something service providers still like to talk about. When we provide information fairs and booths, if we have resources that say elder abuse, the seniors tend to steer away. If you say senior safety, they're more likely to talk to you about it. But it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing being a victim, especially if it's your own flesh and blood that's done it to you. There's also that feeling of helplessness, and that's been verbalized by seniors in saying, who else is going to care for me if I leave? Or, I can't leave this facility and go home, I need care. So they're very feeling helpless and hopeless. Sometimes they lack the ability to, even the language to be able to express. Telling someone that you feel like you've been degraded or demoralized requires language to be able to state those things. Sometimes people are nonverbal, or they're just not able to capture what it is that they're feeling to be able to communicate that. And finally, there's a fear of retaliation. If I tell on my daughter, maybe I won't see my grandchildren again. Or if I tell on the care provider, what's going to happen tomorrow when they come on shift. So those types of things influence them.
Usually the abuser is a person in a position of trust with the senior. It could be a family member, it could be a caregiver.
There's been times where it's somebody that's historically been an excellent care provider and just for whatever circumstances is no longer able to do that, and they snap. Others just are ineffective from the time they enter the field.
Anybody in a position of authority, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a family member, a neighbor, a friend, or anybody in the position to have influence over somebody.
But also, too, it can be a stranger. I always say it can be anybody. Elder abuse does not discriminate. It crosses all cultures, and it can happen to any senior out there.
Typical victims. They say that the increase in age, the older the adult is, the more likely they are to be victimized. Again, statistics show that women are more likely to be victimized, but that's probably a statistical anomaly because there's more older women than there are men. The higher number of vulnerabilities increases the risk of abuse. So if there's a physical and cognitive impairment, anything that creates dependency, whatever factors cause the senior to be dependent on a care provider, is what sets the stage for the opportunity for abuse.